Here we go. Let's talk about this product. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has had a ton of knockout structure decks in the past. Monarchs, Salamangreat, Shadow, each of which was a stepping stone to competitive constructed play. This is not that. You see, every so often, Konami has this harebrained idea that they need to reach out to the community for advice on what product to make. Are you familiar with this community? Dear Reddit, rate my unpopular opinion. Ash should be banned, and Maxi should be at 3. Anyway, in a surprise twist that no one saw coming, the hilarious memesters at reddit.com voted for an Ice Barrier structure deck. Ice Barrier is an archetype well known for being unplayable, not to be confused with Reactors, or Ally of Justice, or Worms, or Crawler, or Crystal Beasts, or Appliancer, or 1 out of every 3 games, Virtual World. So we got this. Now there are some perplexing decisions made here. Icepawn, one of the weirdest floodgates of all time, makes an appearance. Dupe Frog shows up with a grand total of 0 targets, and you will be dead of frostbite before you have a chance to activate and resolve Where Art Thou. Regardless, we're going to see if we can make something out of this. After we've done so, we're going to play a 4-round remote duel local, unsleeved, on a paper mat. Wish me the best of luck. So we've come up with a list, and oh god, it looks so cheap. Look at this. You can even see the creases on the paper mat. Ugh, yuck. It's like an unironed flag in a freshman dorm. So this is Ice Barrier. It's a deck with a bit of an identity crisis. You want to go first because you're playing really powerful continuous trap cards, but you also can't because a significant amount of their really strong cards require your opponent to control monsters. As a result, we'll be blind seconding with a trap lineup. This is not unheard of. Eldritch, for instance, gets a lot of mileage out of flipping something like a Torrential Tribute the turn after their opponent makes VFD. We'll do the same thing, but with Crackdown. I hope that it works. Almost everything in this deck revolves around its newest card, Revealer of the Ice Barrier. This is an insane monster. It does absolutely everything you could ever want. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, your opponent cannot Tribute Summon. This is a running theme with the Ice Barrier monsters. Each one has a mini floodgate that occasionally comes up. As far as floodgates go, Tribute Summoning is pretty strong. Just ask anyone who has ever cited Mask of Restrict. Now, you can only use each of the following effects of her once per turn. This is the good one. You can discard a card to special summon an Ice Barrier tuner from your deck, and we've got some great targets. Also, you can't special summon monsters for the rest of the turn except for water monsters. And if you would discard or send a card from your hand to the graveyard to activate an Ice Barrier monster's effect, you can banish her from your graveyard instead of one of them. Next, we've got General Wayne of the Ice Barrier. This is a 5-star monster, which turns off some of the otherwise really powerful Ice Barriers we would be running. This is a very, very strong card. Its little floodgate effect is that spells and traps sent from the field to your opponent's graveyard are banished instead. Mini Macro is nothing to shake a stick at. Now, you can only use each of his effects once per turn. If your opponent controls a monster and you control an Ice Barrier, you can special it from the hand, and if it's normal or specialed, you can add an Ice Barrier spell trap from your deck to your hand. The Ice Barrier monsters are not very powerful. Their spells and traps are. Next up is 3 Speaker for the Ice Barrier. Look, she's got a little fox. This one, while you control another Ice Barrier monster, prevents defense position monsters your opponent controls from changing their battle positions. It comes up a little less frequently than the other ones. You can only use each of the following effects once per turn. If you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. And if you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can banish it from the graveyard to special summon an Ice Barrier token. This is critical for synchro spamming, which you may have guessed is this deck's win condition. Next up is Hexa, Spirit of the Ice Barrier. And oh, look at that little cutie. Look at that little cutie. Oh, I can't wait to be called a racial slur by someone with this for a profile picture like Chusinoko did. This is a tuner and an Ice Barrier, and as a result, it is your most frequent target for the first card. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, monsters your opponent controls lose 500 attack and defense. That does almost literally nothing, but this card does not stay on the field very long. During your main phase, you can send a level 3 or lower Ice Barrier monster from your deck to the graveyard, and if you do, its level modulates to be the same as the level of the sent monsters. This is very important for getting out your synchro bosses. Next up are some one-ofs. Zujin of the Ice Barrier, and remember, pretty much any monster that says Ice Barrier and has 2 stars is just going to be a send for Hexa. This card can be tributed to summon a level 5 or higher Ice Barrier monster from your hand. And if it's in your graveyard, except the turn it was sent, you can target a level 3 or higher water monster you control, reduce its level by exactly 2, and special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field. Good for follow-up synchro plays. We're also playing Defender of the Ice Barrier. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, monsters your opponent controls cannot declare an attack if their attack is greater than or equal to this card's defense. This comes up a lot in limited formats, and you may remember this card very fondly from Sneaks. We've got Warlock of the Ice Barrier. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, both players must set spell cards before activating them and cannot activate them until their next turn. And we finally got one Cryomancer of the Ice Barrier. This is a tuner and therefore a target. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, level 4 or higher monsters cannot declare an attack. So a lot of conditional floodgates that are incidentally good for swarming for synchro bosses. Now this deck needs extenders. A lot of their synchro monsters require more than one monster to make, and as a result, we need to play a lot of pretty bad cards that do come up quite frequently. We've got 3 Silent Angler. Can you imagine? This card used to be $9. The extender from Plunder Patrol comes home to roost here. It's super simple. If you control a water monster, you can special summon this card from your hand, but you can't special summon monsters from your hand for the rest of the turn. It should be the last thing you're summoning. We've also got 3 Aqua Spirit. This is one of the spirits released way back when. It allows you to banish a water monster from the graveyard in order to summon itself. Useful for fodder, but also has an effect that's incidentally quite good. Once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and change its battle position, and if you do, it can't change for the rest of the turn. So in their standby, you can turn their beater to defense position, and then they can't attack with it. Next are the spells. We've got 3 Winds Over the Ice Barrier. More like wins over the Ice Barrier. Really nothing. Anyway, this card allows you to tribute any number of Ice Barrier monsters to special summon from your deck, that many level 4 or lower Ice Barrier monsters with different names from each other. That's unbelievable. It turns any of your garbage normal summons into the best one you could possibly have. Now, during your main phase, except the turn this card was sent to the graveyard, you can banish it, and then target one of your Ice Barrier monsters that is banished in your graveyard and add it back to your hand. It allows you to repeat them the turn after it's sent. After that, we've got 3 copies of Freezing Chains of the Ice Barrier. When this card's activated, you get to reborn a level 4 or lower Ice Barrier monster in your graveyard, and if you control 3 or more Ice Barrier monsters you control are unaffected by activated effects from your opponent's monsters that were special summoned from the extra deck. You know, they could have just said unaffected by opponent's cards, and this would be exactly as playable. We're playing it for the reborn. I don't care about the protection. Now, you can only activate one of these per turn, but no big deal. I will still be activating one per turn. Next, we've got 3 Medallion of the Ice Barrier, and look how pretty that is. I love cards with one line of text. A non-once-per-turn Rhoda. Add an Ice Barrier monster from your deck to your hand. Fantastic. And as the 40th card, we've got a Salvage. Salvage isn't great, but it does net you advantage and come up when you're trying to rebuild, so it's probably better than playing, like, the on-theme Trishula Trap. For trap cards, we've got 3 copies of Crackdown. This card allows you to target a face-up monster your opponent controls and take control of it. While you control that monster, it can't attack or activate effects. Next up is Fiendish Chain, another continuous trap that locks an opponent's monster, this time by targeting an effect monster on the field, negating the effects of the monster, and preventing it from attack, but keeping it under your opponent's control. Finally, we're playing 3 Heavy Storm Duster. We are quite frequently going to be in a position where we draw enough to go into a Trishula, but can't deal with back row very effectively. As a result, Heavy Storm Duster allows us to pop them on our opponent's turn. So that's the main deck. Pretty exciting for one of the worst structures of all time. But we've also got an extra deck. We are playing 3 copies of Trishula Zero. This is, I think, the first good 11 synchro in a long time. This can be made with 1 tuner and 2 or more non-tuner monsters. And when this card is synchro summoned, you can banish up to 3 cards your opponent controls. Doesn't target, doesn't discriminate. If the synchro summoned card in its owner's control is destroyed by an opponent's card, that's effect or battle, you can special summon a Trishula from your extra deck. Its attack becomes 33,000, and all your opponent's face-up monsters are halved, and their effects are also negated, which is incredible, but realistically, it's such a big blowout that your opponent is never going to walk into this face-up combat trick. It's also got a once per turn, which is hilarious given that Trishula is still limited. Next up is Gungnir, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. You may remember this from really old Gold Sarcophagus DDR Coelacanth OTK decks. This was critical in putting 8,000 damage on board. Once per turn, you can discard 2 cards from your hand to the graveyard, then target the same number of cards your opponent controls and destroy them. It's okay. Speaking of cards that are okay, we've got 3 Brionac, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, which has unfortunately been eroded. This allows you to discard any number of cards from your hand to the graveyard, then target the same number of cards your opponent controls, return them to the hand, and you can only activate its effect once per turn. Finally, we've got 1 copy of Duloran, still limited for the time being, though this does have the errata. Allows you to target any number of face-up cards you control, return them to the hand, and this card gains 500 for each card returned to the hand by this effect. We're not going to be able to make any loops using the cards in this, though maybe returning a Fiendish Chain would be funny. And finally, good old Trish returns. Still at 1, I maintain this card could come to 3. When this card is synchro summoned, you could banish up to 1 card each from your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard. And thank you to the 1 card each, allowing us to activate this on turn 1. Finally, there is enough random garbage in these decks that we can put together a sizable side deck as well. I've got 3 Spellbreaker of the Ice Barrier. Now, this is the most suspect card in the list for sure. Once per turn, you can send an Ice Barrier monster from your hand to the graveyard. Neither player can activate spell cards until the end of your next turn, while this monster is face up on the field. So if they out it, they can start activating spell cards, but it's not hard to imagine a deck that would have a little bit of trouble outing a card like this, especially when backed up by something like a Fiendish Chain, and as a result, I think it would be a very funny way to keep your opponent off of spell cards, if not permanently long enough for you to establish a Trish. Next, the actually playables. 3 Mirror of the Ice Barrier. Now, you may remember this card is an actual thing people cited for a non-zero portion of time. During this turn, each time a card is banished from the hand, field, and graveyard by your opponent's activated monster effect, apply the following effects based on where the cards were banished from. If it's from the hand, you can banish 2 cards from your opponent's hand. From the field, you can banish 2 cards your opponent controls, or from the graveyard, banish 2 cards in your opponent's graveyard. Against graveyard decks, this is killer. Imagine firing this off after an Eldritch player banishes a Scarlet Sanguine, only to take the remainder of their continuous traps. And if you ever get any of the other 2 effects, you win the game on the spot. Next is Mind Drain. I don't know about this one. We do have some monster effects that activate in the hand, so it might not be a good idea to be playing this. I don't actually know why it's included, but it also turns off hand traps, which could potentially come up. Our spell cards are pretty much all huge targets that say, please ash me, so could be realistic that we board this. We're also playing 3 Iceborne because it's funny. If a non-water monster is normal or special summoned while you control a water monster, that monster changes to defense position. It's kind of an AoE threatening roar, except for the fact that Link monsters exist. And finally, the only actually good card we've got in here, 3 Appointer of the Red Lotus. You're allowed to pay 2,000 life points, reveal your entire hand, look at your opponent's hand, and banish 1 card from it until the next end phase. And really, we're just looking for that 1 opener to start resolving Trishes. So that's that. I hope to see you for part 2, where I will be putting my nose to the grindstone and my world's points in the dumpster.